This is part 2 in our lecture on the Washington administration for U.S. history. So in the last lecture, the last part, we talked about the domestic events of the Washington administration, how he was setting precedents and all the different development of political parties that was going on between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. And so in part 2, we're going to look at the foreign policy of the Washington administration. And so our story starts back in France. So in 1789, the French are going to have a revolution that was caused in part by the American Revolution. During the American Revolution, the French had aided the United States and given them lots of money and weapons, sent an army to the United States, and so the French were in debt. And so the French wanted the United States government to pay them back, but at that time, the United States had the Articles of Confederation, and they weren't able to pay back France. And so France got into deeper and deeper debt, and so France decided to raise taxes. The king decided to raise taxes on his people. This, along with some other things, led to the French Revolution. The people rebel, and it's an Enlightenment revolution. It's the idea of liberty, equality, brotherhood, as we see in this picture here, and it's inspired for democracy for the people, right? So that's why it's similar to the American Revolution in terms of these ideals of democracy and liberty. And so the French Revolution takes off. They overthrow the king. The king is eventually killed. And this revolution then starts to destabilize the European political situation. The other kings in Europe start to get a little nervous about what's going on in France. They send armies in to stop the French Revolution because they're afraid that it might spread to their countries and maybe their people will kill their kings, just like the French people did. And so we see that now France is embroiled not just in a civil war as people are rising up against the elite, but also other countries are fighting France to try to stop this internal rebellion. And so Thomas Jefferson says, Thomas Jefferson, remember the Secretary of State, he says, we have to help France, right? Number one, because we have a treaty of alliance with them, which we did at that point. We still had a treaty that says that we are friends with France, and if anybody attacks France, we're going to help them out. And so we should honor that treaty. In addition, he sees a kinship with France. He says Thomas Jefferson believes in equality and democracy, and he believes in the Enlightenment. And so he says, look, France is is doing just what we did. They rebelled against the king, and they're asking for more freedom and equality and liberty, and so we should help them out. Not just because we have a treaty, but we should, but it's also because they are believing in the same ideals that we believe in. And so we are ideological brothers, right? We should help each other out. Now, and so his Democratic Republican supporters say, yes, we support this. Now, Hamilton and his supporters are like, no, we are not getting involved in this war. One, because Hamilton is a Francophobe, right? He does not like the French. Hamilton believes in rule by a small group of intellectual, educated people who can guide the country to be more successful. And he does not think, he doesn't want what happens in France to happen in America, where we have these poor people rising up, beheading people, rich people dying all over the place as the poor people rise up. And he's like, no, I don't want any part of that, right? He also says that America is just too young and too inexperienced to get involved in some big European war. And so we shouldn't get involved because we're not ready, and we shouldn't get involved because we don't want the French Revolution spreading to America. We don't want the poor rising up and overthrowing the elite. And so here's yet another example of political parties are forming around issues. The last lecture we just talked about domestic issues. So this lecture we see it also, the foreign policy is causing a split in America into these two parties. Right. And so we see, as we had talked about in our last slide, that the war in France does spread as other monarchs are concerned that their people will take up the French Revolution as well, and so they invade France. And so, the question is, do we honor the treaty? And as we said in the last slide, the Democratic Republicans say yes. The Federalists say no. The Federalists use this term mobocracy, which is where, the mob rules, and that's what happens when you give power to the people. And so we're right to say that only middle and upper class people really should be running things, not the lower classes. And so we have this what's going on in Europe really reflects and mirrors kind of the differences between America's political parties here at home. Right? And so what does Washington do? Does he listen to his Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton, who says, don't get involved? Does he listen to his Secretary of the State, Jefferson, who says, do get involved? And so Washington issues the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793. He doesn't ask Congress or anybody else for guidance on this. He just says, look, this is my power as the president, and I'm gonna just say we're gonna be neutral, right? And his main reason is because the United States is a brand new country, and we are not ready to take on England in another big war. We might lose our independence. We're just too young and we're just too weak, and so let's not do it. Now, this is an expansion of the executive powers branch, this executive branch's power here, because nowhere in the Constitution does it say that he can just issue this proclamation. It doesn't say he can't, right? And so by taking a power, he assumes a power for the executive branch that other presidents will follow. And so here's another example of Washington kind of setting precedents that we now know that the president, it's confirmed, the president is the leader of foreign policy, and sometimes he doesn't even have to ask Congress's approval. And so this is going to be what some future presidents say, oh, well, Washington did it, so can I. And so he's setting precedents for future presidents. Right. He says, however, we're going to be neutral. We're not going to get involved in either side of the war. We're not sending troops. We're not sending a navy because we really don't have one. And he says, but we will trade with everybody, right? Because this is a great way for America to make a buck, right? England and France and all the other countries in Europe that are at war, of course, their young men are fighting, not farming. And so they all need food to feed their people and their armies. And so we just happen to produce a lot of food. And so he says America can make a lot of money selling to both sides if we're neutral. And so this also was on his mind, and it certainly will help the U.S. economy as we go through the rest of his presidency. So we had already said that this is notable because it's going to be an expansion of the president's power, but also it's notable because he is setting the precedent that America is going to practice the policy of isolationism, which in other words, America is going to ignore what's going on over there across the ocean, and we're just going to focus on ourselves, right? And this is something that a lot of U.S. presidents will take up. They're like, well, if it was good enough for Washington, it's good enough for me. This is what America should be doing. And so it sets this policy, this president. And I've already talked about expansion of presidential power. All right, and so we're not going to help out France, and we're going to just trade with both sides. And you think, well, certainly that would make France upset because we're not honoring the treaty. But England is going to get upset with us too, because as part of Washington's neutrality, we're going to trade with England, which is fine for England, but we're also going to trade with France because we're not getting involved militarily, and we're going to sell to everybody economically. Well, England is like, wait a minute, United States, it's good that you're trading with us for food because we need that, but we don't want you trading with France for food, right? That every shipment of food you send to France is going to feed their soldiers, and those soldiers are then going to have a full tummy, and then they're going to kill English people. No. America, you need to stop trading with our French enemies. And we're like, you can't tell us what to do. We're America. We can trade with whoever we want. And so now we have some friction going on between the United States under Washington and England. All right. And so what does England start to do? They start to seize our ships. As we see American ships are starting to approach the coast of France, British ships intercept them, and they take the ship, and they take their cargo. Now, that is an act of war. The international waters are supposed to be free for everybody to trade on, and if you just attack our ships, that's a declaration of war, right? And so, that's an act of war, and so we see that Americans are starting to get upset about the English seizing our ships. We're losing money, but we're also, it's a question of our national rights. In addition to that, sometimes English will stop American ships on the ocean, and they will look through the sailors on the ship, and they'll say, oh, this guy's a runaway. He's a runaway sailor from the British Navy. And so we're going to put him back into the British Navy. It's called impressment, to forcibly take people off land or off a ship and make them go into the Navy. In this particular case, it's off ships. Now, in some cases, some of the sailors on American ships, they were British sailors that had illegally kind of ran away from the British Navy. And so maybe they have a point there, but who says they can just abduct them off our ships? And sometimes they took American citizens off ships and erroneously saying that these people are British citizens. And so once again, this is a slap in the face to Americans because it's not respecting our rights as a country, as an independent country, as a neutral nation. And so we see Democratic Republicans in America start to call for war, right? Because one, they want to help France out anyway, and we have a treaty of alliance with France. And two, England is provoking us, so we need to go to war. And it looks like Washington's neutrality is not working, right? And so we see, so blockade French West Indies to U.S. ships. And so this is another thing the English are doing. Not only are they seizing our ships, not only are they impressing our sailors, but they're also refusing to let us trade with the French West Indies, which we send food and lumber down to the French West Indies, and then those French plantation owners use it to feed their slaves to grow sugar, which is critical for the French war effort because the French can sell that sugar at a high price and pay for guns and ammunition and cannons. And so, this is not in England's interest to let us continue to feed the French African slaves in the Caribbean. And so they say, you can't trade with the French. Well, who are they to tell us what to do, the Americans say? We can trade with whoever we want to, so once again, it's a slap in the face to our national rights. All right? In addition to that, if you remember in the Treaty of Paris, England said that they would give us all the land east of the Mississippi. It now belongs to the United States, which they did, but they kept some of the forts out west because the English wanted some of that, money-making fur trade. And so some English are still in some of these forts out west, and by the way, arming Native Americans to attack Americans who are trying to move west. And so here we have England on U.S. soil arming Native Americans to kill American settlers. And so this has to stop. Again, it's a slap in our face as national honor goes. And so becomes this big movement among certainly Democratic Republicans to go to war against England. Right? So what should we do? Well, just like George Washington said we earlier cannot go to war, he issued his Neutrality Proclamation. With all of these new events that's happened, he still believes we cannot go to war. And so he has to at all costs avoid war with England. So he sends John Jay to England to try to work out some kind of a treaty that we can stop this march towards war that we have going on with England because we're not ready. George knows we'll lose it. And so that's why he goes to England to avoid this war. And he comes back with a treaty. The treaty promises that England once again promises that they will evacuate the forts out west. The United States once again England promises to pay off the damages caused to American merchants by seizing their ships and their cargoes, right? And so that is designed to make America happy. The U.S. promises to pressure our own citizens to pay back our pre-Revolutionary War debts to British merchants. If you remember, we had talked about that the Treaty of Paris said we were going to do this, and we never did. And so English merchants still have these, debts they want to collect from American merchants and from American customers. And so we say, okay, we'll try. Of course, it doesn't happen, but we say we're going to try, right? And of course, most importantly, the treaty is going to avoid war with the English. Now, when Jay comes back with the treaty, this is going to make the Democratic Republicans very mad because we're missing an opportunity to help our friends, the French. And so they're very upset with this, and England didn't promise to respect our rights in the future, and so they're very mad. And so we see them burning effigies of John Jay and his treaty when he comes back. Now, this is not Jay himself, thankfully, for John Jay, but it's just a mock-up of him. And this is like these Democratic Republican mobs are saying, if we could get our hands on John Jay, this is what we would do to him. And so John Jay talks about, as word of his treaty precedes him back to America. As his boat is coming up the coast of America, he said, I could travel the length of the country by the light of people burning my treaty and me in effigy. And so we see that this just further splits the two parties in America. The Democratic Republicans certainly don't like the treaty, and they wanted to go to war with the British, and the Federalists are happy for the treaty, right? Because even though it doesn't respect our rights as an independent nation, it doesn't say England will respect us, it does avoid war with England. And the Federalist Party is increasingly thinking that we should be friends with England for business, right? They could be a great trading partner for us. And if you remember, the Federalists really like business. All right, and so that takes care of kind of the foreign policy of George Washington vis-a-vis or dealing with Europe and this whole revolution going on in Europe. So now let's talk about Washington and the frontier. And so as the Treaty of Paris ended, we were supposed to get all of this land from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, and so farmers start pouring west into the Ohio River and into the Trans-Appalachian Southwest. And so great. So we see farmers start to, open up farms up here, and they're very happy about this. And so we start to see farms all over the place and open up. And so here's a farm, etc. That's kind of where the farms were. And so we see that if I'm a farmer and I want to get my crops to market, and we've talked about this in our previous lecture, there is no good road for me to just kind of take my farm goods and just move them from west to east and get them to the markets of the east. It just hasn't been built. And so the quickest way for farmers west of the Appalachian Mountains to get their crops to market was to go down, this is the Ohio River, to go down the Ohio River, to join the Mississippi River, go all the way down the Mississippi River, out through the Spanish port of New Orleans, right? And then around Florida and eventually up to, Charleston or Raleigh or Boston or New York, right? That, believe it or not, was much quicker and less trouble for farmers in Kentucky and what will be Ohio to get their crops to market. And so Spain knows this, right? And Spain at this point controls New Orleans. And so Spain is looking at the United States and they're getting nervous, right? Because the Americans are increasingly moving west. And over here, Louisiana at this point belongs to the Spanish. And as more and more and more Americans flood west, they're like, oh my gosh, they might eventually someday pose a threat to our control of Louisiana. And we want to stop Americans from moving west. And we want to, not incentivize them to move west. And so if we block off their access to the rest of the country, maybe these farmers will stop moving west, or maybe they'll get so angry with their ineffective government by not being able to open up the port of New Orleans that maybe they'll rebel. And we talked about this under the Articles of Confederation lecture. And so it's in Spain's interest to, cut off the port of New Orleans. And so, what should the United States do about this? And in addition to that, the United States and Spain are disagreeing over where the southern boundary of the United States is. Now, the Treaty of Paris says it goes west of the Mississippi River, but how far south does it go? It doesn't really say. And so this is land claimed both by Spain and by the new United States. Of course, Native Americans are living there as well. And so we have a disagreement with Spain over this. And so what we do is Washington helps to create this thing called Pinckney's Treaty, which tries to solve some of these problems. And so Pinckney's Treaty, it says that, okay, so American farmers can pass through and make use of the port of New Orleans. And that's going to really help the western economy of the United States grow, and more people are going to move west. In addition to that, it sets the boundary of the United States at the 31st parallel, which just is right here, right? Today, the northern part of Florida. And so it's going to extend it all the way to the Mississippi. And so now Spain and America are not disagreeing over this boundary. So the United States is shoring up some of its boundaries. Now, why would Spain do this? Well, Spain is currently fighting France. And they have had a couple losses with France, and they're afraid that the Americans might join England in the war against France if America listens to the Federalists, and so they don't want an enemy of America. Especially here in the New World. And so all of those things we don't necessarily need to know. We just need to know that Spain was motivated to try to solve their issues with the United States, and they do with Pinckney's Treaty. And the big takeaway for U.S. history is that this treaty is going to make it safer and more economically viable for people to move west. And so there's just a big flood of Americans moving west because now they know they have a way to get their crops to market. And they also know that there's not going to be some war with the Spanish, right, over this territory, where the boundary is. All right, so let's talk about, that's a good segue into native resistance, right? So as the Treaty of Paris was over, and now this territory belongs to the United States, the natives in what we call the Northwest, this area up here, the natives in the Northwest, they used to have the French to trade furs with to get guns to stop the white settlers from moving west, and then they had the English to trade with after the Proclamation of 1763 to get guns to stop Americans from colonists from moving west. But now that England is gone, right, we see that there really is not that many people to trade furs with for guns. And so a whole flood of Americans go across the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio River Valley, especially this area right here, which today is Ohio. And so we see that the natives who live there are under tremendous pressure to not lose their way of life, not to be killed and to lose their land by all of these Americans moving in. And so two Native American chiefs are going to try to create a pan-Indian Native alliance to try to band together to stop all of these white settlers from moving west. And their names are Chief Little Turtle and Chief Blue Jacket. And they're the Miami and Shawnee Indians, Native Americans, and their goal is to band together and stop this westward migration. And they have some limited success in the beginning, but as time goes on, there's just too many American settlers moving west for them to cope with. Plus, they don't have anybody anymore to get guns with anymore. And so eventually the natives will lose at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. And at this battle, they're devastated, and so they're forced to sign the Treaty of Greenville, which basically gives up most of northwestern Ohio, which is this area right here. And so now Native Americans are either going to be killed because of this war, or they're going to be, as we've seen again and again and again, pushed west. Of course, where do they go west? There are other Native Americans who live further west that don't want these natives with them. And so we see this is really the end of a way of life for these tribes who live in this area. Right? Now, as this treaty is made, we see that the United States does not really hold true to the treaty. Neither do the states. In part because they don't want to. We have more and more white settlers wanting to move west and take up even more of the natives' land. And also, when a state or a group of people or the United States government makes a treaty with a tribe of natives, they think that's true for all of the natives that live in the region. But there are all different kinds of tribes. And just because I make a treaty with the Shawnee doesn't mean I've made a treaty with the Miami tribe. Or just because I've made a treaty with one part of the Shawnee, that doesn't mean I've made a treaty with all parts of the Shawnee, because the United States and people in America do not understand that the natives are not in one big government like the United States is. They're loosely divided among all of these different tribes that are kind of loosely allied and together, and just because you make a treaty with one doesn't mean you make a treaty with all. And so if we've made a treaty with, tribe A, then when tribe B attacks us, we think, well, that means we have to fight everybody, tribe A and tribe B, because we think they're all one tribe, if this makes any sense. And so not understanding the tribal structure of Native Americans is going to lead to a lot of confusion and a lot of continued fighting on the frontier. And so we see that this is just going to happen again and again and again as we continue to move west. All right, so now let's finish up Washington's administration. And so Washington, he decides, as his second term is coming to an end, he decides not to run for a third term. There was no restriction in the Constitution from him running for a third term. He's just getting older and he's tired. And for a lot of his adult life, he served his country either in the military or as President of the United States, and he wants to go back to his plantation. And so he decides to write a farewell address, kind of in the sense of a wise father giving advice to his children before he leaves, right? That kind of thing. And so in his very famous farewell address in 1796, he and Hamilton kind of write it together, and Washington issues it, and he warns America against pitfalls that he sees approaching our future, things that could make our country fall apart. And so one of them, he says, avoid entangling alliances. What he means by that is he understands Americans might have to make treaties of alliance in the international community. That's fine, but he wants them to be temporary. He doesn't want them to be everlasting, because the United States made a treaty of alliance with France in the past, and there was no end date to it. And so that almost dragged us into war with England during his presidency, which we would have lost. And so he says, look, Americans, try to be isolationists if you can. Try to avoid getting involved in European conflicts, and certainly don't make a long-lasting treaty that has no end date, because America should just not get involved in those conflicts. So that's the first thing he warns us against. And then the second thing, let's read the quote, right? He's talking about political parties. So political parties serve always to distract the public councils, enfeeble the public administration. In other words, when we try to get stuff done, if we're divided into parties, we're divided against ourselves, and we can't move forward as a united country. It agitates political parties, agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, all kinds of false narratives and false news are spread out there, and it just keeps us from being a united group of people when dealing with our own problems and problems with other countries. He says parties kindle the hatred, the animosity of one part of the country against another, foments occasional riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption. And he's talking about other countries trying to get involved in our own politics. And so, of course, this is something that we will continue to deal with as Americans until even today, how political parties disunite us. It makes us have less of an ability to solve our problems and to deal with other countries. And so he really is warning against parties. He says, look, there were no parties when I took office, and with no fault of my own parties, he's saying parties were created between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and can't we just all get along and be Americans and move forward? And of course, no. I mean, if you have a democracy where people have freedom of speech, they're going to naturally go into different political parties, and that's what happened. But he's hoping that we can avoid this. And so here is Washington in his famous farewell address saying this goodbye. Now, of course, this is another precedent that this president sets. And so many presidents in the future will do the same thing, right? They're kind of reflecting on their time in office, and they're trying to give America advice going forward. And we'll talk about other kind of farewell addresses by other presidents in the future. But one final precedent he also sets is he sets the idea that presidents should not serve more than 2 terms. Now, again, there's nothing in the Constitution at that point that says that presidents can't do that, but it becomes tradition. And so in the future, all future presidents will abide by that tradition that Washington set. It becomes part of who we are as a country, and eventually we'll make it into a constitutional amendment after we have a president get elected 4 times, FDR, but that's way into the future. And so here is just one more example of Washington kind of setting traditions for our country. And so let's look at the key concepts. So it says, analyze the various issues around U.S. foreign policy that led to the first political parties. And this is really the trouble with the French Revolution. Should we get involved and honor our French alliance, or should we not? Should we stay neutral? And of course, Washington tried his Neutrality Proclamation, and then he did John Jay's Treaty. And this, of course, is just going to further split the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans apart, because one wants to support the British, one wants to support the French. Number 4, analyze the twin goals of Washington's farewell address. We just started to talk about that, and we said that his goals are to say America should be isolationist whenever possible, and then America should avoid continuing to have political parties. And number 5, it says, describe the difficulties the Washington administration faced on the frontier with Native Americans and the Spanish and how they dealt with these challenges. And the difficulties, let's start with Native Americans, is because so many Americans are moving west because it's our territory now, our being the United States territory now. And of course, the Native Americans did not want to lose their way of life and their very lives. And so we saw Chief Little Turtle and Chief Blue Jacket organize these armed insurgencies against the United States to try to protect their land. And we see that it didn't end well for the Native Americans. And the Spanish, we talked about Pinckney's treaty, which kind of settled the border of the southern part of the United States and gave the United States access to New Orleans. And so pretty active two terms for President Washington. And that's it for part 2.